This broadcast is brought to you by the British Israel Church of God. The Watchman Program. Evangelist and commentator Peter Salemi, bringing you the truth about today's world news in the light of Bible prophecy.
Now that we are approaching the Christmas season, the story of the birth of Christ comes up, the story that you read of in the Gospels, because many people believe that Jesus Christ was born on December 25th. Now, we take issue with the date of the birth of Christ in other broadcasts you could see on our YouTube channel, and we prove to you that Jesus Christ was born in September on the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, and you can take a look at that on our YouTube channel. But today we're going to take issue with the birth of Christ and the circumstances that surround the birth of Christ. Now we're dealing with this because, of course, the birth of Christ does come up during this time of year. Now, when people think of the birth of Christ, they have this image in their mind, and we're going to show you that image on the screen right now. And of course, this is the image that most people portray in their minds. Three wise men with three gifts coming to the manger, to the Lord Jesus, and the stars above the manger there, and there's Joseph and Mary. And people believe that this is what happened during the time when Christ was born. Now, it's almost like a cartoon fantasy when you see that image. There's nobody around. There are no social and political repercussions to this. And I keep insisting that these people were real people living in a real world with real political and social situations that were going on around them, and they were subject to it. But not according to that image. It's almost like a fantasy. It's almost like a cartoon that you watch, and all the circumstances around them just don't matter, or they just don't exist. But really, what happened during the time of the birth of Christ? When you look at the political circumstances that are going on around the birth of Christ, when you understand who the wise men really are, and when they came, and how they came, well, you'll look at the birth of Christ in a whole different light, and you'll see it in a very real world, with very real circumstances. Now, when Jesus was born, the Gospels plainly say that the wise men came and presented unto him gifts. Now, when the wise men came, it's almost like when you see it portrayed in the movies, it's almost like they kind of snuck in. No one knew who they were and why they were there. And when they left, they kind of snuck away, and no one kind of knew anything about it, and there were no repercussions whatsoever. But when you look at the real historical circumstances, when you look at who the wise men really are, and the situation that was going on with Rome and the wise men, where they came from, Rome and the country that the wise men came from actually had wars. And there was a peace that went on between these two countries, and of course it was Rome, and these wise men came from the east, and who controlled the east at that time but the Parthian Empire. Now, you want to know who the Parthians really are? I urge you to read our booklet, The United States and the British Commonwealth in Prophecy, and we will show you that the Parthians are the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And they also had a large Jewish population as well, because only a remnant of Jews returned from Babylon. Most of them stayed. And at that time, many of the Parthian Jews came into Palestine to worship God on many of the feasts that you read of in Acts, the 2nd chapter. It says Jews and proselytes, and they came from Parthia. You can read that in Acts, the 2nd chapter, and verse 9. So they had a large Jewish population. But these Parthians are part of the lost 10 tribes of Israel, and they went to war with Rome many, many times. And before Herod was king of Judea, there was a Parthian vassal king who ruled Palestine for a very short time. But then when the Parthians retreated, Rome took over and put Herod in charge of Judea. Now I want to read you something from Stephen Collins' book, The Lost 10 Tribes of Israel Found. Excellent book. I urge everyone to pick up this book. You can probably go to his website and order it. He's got nothing to do with us, but I urge everybody to read this book and get the real story of what happened during the time of Jesus Christ and his birth. On page 267 it says this: in the decades previous to the birth of Jesus, Rome and Parthia fought several battles, with one being fought near Antioch in Syria, which is of course very close to Palestine. In about 40 BC, the Parthians launched a major assault which swept the Romans out of Asia for a short time. For 3 years, and this is during 40 to 37 BC, Palestine was within the Parthian Empire. A lot of people don't know that except for historians. Palestine was part of the Parthian Empire and was ruled by a Jewish vassal king of the Parthians named Antigonus. At that time, King Herod, the Roman king of Judea, fled from the Parthians in fear of his life. While the Parthian-sponsored rule of Antigonus was brief, it was apparently popular with the Jews. When the Parthians withdrew across the Euphrates, Antigonus, with Jewish support, attempted to maintain himself king of the Jews, but was defeated by Herod. And then, of course, Herod took over Jerusalem in 36. So there was that skirmish over Palestine. Herod took over Palestine, but then after that there was a prolonged period of peace, as it says here, in 36 BC until 58 AD. And then Augustus had a truce between Parthia and Rome. And it says here, this is a well-known fact, that Augustus left it as a principle of policy to his successors that the Roman Empire had reached its proper limits and could not with advantage be extended any further. This principle, followed with the utmost strictness by Tiberius, was accepted as a rule by all the earlier Caesars. So Augustus didn't want the Roman Empire to expand any further, and they wanted to keep the peace. And so there was a peace between Parthia and Rome during that time. And Tiberius stuck to that peace treaty. Now, what does this have to do with the birth of Christ? Well, the wise men that came were magi, as it says here. And let me read it to you in Matthew, the 2nd chapter, verse 1. It says, then when Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, in the days of Herod the king, behold, came wise men from the east to Jerusalem. They went to Jerusalem's capital. Now, when they went to Jerusalem's capital, what did they see? What did the Jews and King Herod see? Well, notice what it says here back in this book. It says, the Magi were powerful members of the two assemblies which elected Parthian monarchs and wielded great influence within the empire. So here we see the wise men coming from Parthia, and these people had great influence in the empire, had high positions in the Parthian Empire, and they had a truce. And here they come into Jerusalem looking for the king of the Jews. And they didn't mean Herod. Now it goes on to say, one assembly was composed of members of the royal family, and the other consisted of priests, the Magi, and they were influential Parthians of non-royal blood. The Magi and the wise men were jointly known as the Magistans. The King James Version of the Bible states in Matthew 2:1 that the wise men from the east came to worship Jesus. The term wise men can be seen as the proper title of the Parthian Magistans. The Greek word translated wise men is magician, literally meaning Persian astronomer or priest. So this is a priesthood. Parthia had long governed all the Persian territory at the time of Christ, and the wise men cited in the Bible were clearly members of the Magistan's very high Parthian officials. So here, these are Parthian officials that are coming to worship the King of the Jews, Jesus Christ. They weren't three wise men coming on camels by themselves with no escorts coming to worship Christ. Now, I want to offer you this free booklet before I go on with some of these other historical facts that people seem to miss when it comes to the birth of Jesus Christ. And it's called, Is Christmas Christian? Free of charge off our website, britishisrael.ca. And we go through many things about Christmas, Santa Claus, the holly wreath, the Christmas tree, and so on. And we also deal with some of these things that we're dealing with here in this program. You can download it off our website, britishisrael.ca. Now, if you want to know more about the British Israel Church of God, Bill Pitzinas will give you the addresses and phone numbers where you can obtain more information about our organization. When the Parthian Magi came to Jerusalem, it was a very public event. The Bible plainly says in verse 3 that all of Jerusalem was troubled. The whole capital of Jerusalem, including King Herod, was troubled when they came. Because remember, there was a truce between Parthia and Rome. And here are the Parthians coming in, Parthian nobility coming in and asking about the King of the Jews. And they didn't mean Herod. So all of Jerusalem was troubled. It was a very public event. And they came with gifts to give to a king. Now, when these Parthian nobility, when these Parthians came in and they were giving gifts to a king, they didn't come with little gifts in their hands, little pieces of gold and frankincense and myrrh like you see in that image that we showed you earlier. No, they came with a caravan full of gifts and with several hundred soldiers. Now, many people think that there were three wise men, but the Bible doesn't say that there were three wise men. It just says wise men from the east. That means there could have been 2 or 150. But it was a very considerate size army that came, caravans and camels and so on. And it was, of course, a long journey. So there was probably several hundred soldiers, several hundred people that came to visit Christ, and not 3 people on camels. And it was a very public affair. Now I want to read you again back in this book. And it says on page 270, their arrival in Jerusalem, the wise men, was a very public affair because all of Jerusalem was troubled by their arrival. This indicates that the Magi, a delegation of a dozen or more high Parthian officials, came to Jerusalem in a caravan loaded with costly treasures and escorted by a strong force of armed Parthian soldiers. They're not going to go around with treasures without soldiers to guard it. Since the Magi were high officials of the Parthian government, they would customarily travel with a substantial escort of Parthian soldiers to guarantee their protection, since they were traveling with many costly treasures to present to the newborn Messiah. And then it says, their caravan was so big that their arrival quickly became a cause for concern in Jerusalem. The whole city was in an uproar over their arrival, and that argues for a very visible, impressive Parthian caravan arriving in Jerusalem not long after Jesus' birth in Bethlehem. The sheer size of the caravan, its treasures, its escorts, awed King Herod and the whole city to the point where they were all troubled. So this is what you really see when you put it in a historical context. Parthian nobility coming with a huge caravan with costly gifts, soldiers coming into Jerusalem and inquiring where the King of the Jews would be born. And why were they looking for Christ? Well, these Parthian nobles, they were in charge of keeping track of royal Parthian blood that were in foreign nations. And they had records. They had genealogies. And they understood that a king of the Jews, who was a king, descendant of King David, and the Parthian nobility, they were descendants of King David. And again, I urge you to read our booklet, U.S. in Prophecy, and we will prove that to you. And also the Throne of David in Prophecy that you can download off our website as well, that goes through some of these things that we're discussing here on this program. So they knew that a king of a descendant of David was to be born. They also understood Daniel, the 9th chapter, verses 24 through 26, that talks about the Messiah that was to come during the time of the first century. So they knew that something was going to happen. They were looking for a king, and then the star appeared, and they followed the star. They knew it was significant that the star was leading them to Judea. So they were looking for a king. They were looking for a Parthian monarch, and that actually made Jesus eligible for the Parthian throne. And this is why they gave him all gifts. And why do you think Herod wanted Jesus destroyed? Because here they see a Parthian nobility coming in, giving gifts, and he saw Jesus as a king who was backed by the Parthian Empire in his own borders. So of course he saw Jesus as a threat. And he wanted to get rid of that threat. And of course, Jesus, he escaped and of course went into Egypt. Now they went into Egypt because in Egypt they had a large Jewish population, in most likely Alexandria in Egypt. So they stayed with many Jews in Alexandria. Maybe Joseph and Mary had relatives in Egypt and stayed with them. But again, now this Parthian Magi, when they came, did you know that they probably came 1 year later? That they didn't come that very night? And it says here, let me just read it to you in Matthew the 2nd chapter, verse 2. It says, and when they, that's the Magi, were come into the house, a house. They didn't come to a manger. It says they came into a house, and they saw the young child. They didn't see a babe wrapped in swaddling clothes like you read of in the book of Luke in a manger. They came into a house and saw the young child with Mary his mother, fell down and worshiped him, and they had opened their treasures, and they presented unto him gifts. They presented unto who gifts? Each other, right? Wrong. Absolutely wrong. They presented unto Christ gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. They gave it to Christ. They didn't give it to each other. They didn't say, well, what do you got there, Harold? Well, I got some gold. Well, what do you got there, Henry? I got some frankincense. And they sang a carol or two, exchanged gifts to one another, and then left praising God and left Christ sitting there going, but what about me? It didn't happen that way. They presented unto Christ gifts, gold, frankincense, and myrrh. Now, because there were three categories of gifts, many people believe that there were three wise men. But of course, the Bible doesn't say there were three, and most likely there was a few dozen of them with armed guards, soldiers, and caravans, and came to the house in Bethlehem. And of course, Herod probably sent his spies to see which kid it was that was to be king of the Jews. And then, of course, here it says they being warned of God in a dream that they should not return to Herod, they departed into their own country another way. Now, notice what it says here in verse 16. It says that he slew all the children that were in Bethlehem, this is King Herod, and in all the coasts thereof, from 2 years old and under, according to the time which he had diligently inquired of the wise men. So from 2 years old and under, he slayed all those poor children. And so Jesus must have been at least a year old when the wise men came, because they came into the house where the young child was. A story totally different from what you're used to every single year at Christmas time. Every single year at Christmas time, you get this same story over and over again. 3 wise men coming to the manger and worshiping Christ and then leaving without anybody noticing. But when you look at the Gospel of Luke, you don't see the wise men. There's no story about a wise man in the Gospel of Luke, because the Gospel of Luke deals with the birth of Christ that night. The Gospel of Matthew deals with the wise men, and they came a year later. A lot of people think there's a contradiction, but there is no contradiction whatsoever. When you read the story in its context, you will see that the wise men came a year later. Luke deals with the birth of Christ that night. I want you to get this free booklet, Is Christmas Christian?, free of charge, off our website, britishisrael.ca. Take a look at this, and I'll be right back.
Men shall beat their swords into plowshares, and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war any more.
When will the dreams of men become reality? The whole message of Jesus Christ is about a soon-coming world government that will bring peace to our troubled world. For a full understanding of this message of hope about the kingdom of God, request your free booklet, What is the Real Gospel? Download your free copy at www.britishisrael.ca. For a free hard copy, call or text your order at 905-447-4415 or 416-898-7407.
Many people believe that Jesus was a poor man. You hear many a preacher talk about how this poor person with raggedy clothes, and he was dwelling in the streets, the dusty streets of Palestine, dirty and grimy, was a threat to the Romans and the Jewish Sanhedrin. He was a threat to them, and he was just this poor, humble man from Nazareth. But when you look at the historical evidence, Jesus was actually a very wealthy man. Jesus actually owned probably a couple of homes, was a taxpayer, and when you read of the gifts that he was given in Matthew the 2nd chapter of gold, frankincense, and myrrh, you have to remember this is Parthian nobility. They didn't come with, as I said earlier, gold and frankincense and myrrh that you could fit in the palm of your hands. They came with a caravan full of these items, and Jesus became a very wealthy person. Let me just read to you from this book again on page 306. It says here, a third reason that enabled Jesus to go wherever he wished and do whatever he pleased was the fact that Jesus was wealthy. The Parthian Magi had given Jesus costly gifts of gold, myrrh, and frankincense. We are not told how much gold and costly spices were given to Jesus, but it was no doubt a substantial amount. The Parthians regarded Jesus as royalty, and it was the ancient custom to give a royal personage a truly worthy gift when coming into his presence. Since the Parthian Magi were directed to Jesus by an angel of God, their sense of awe likely resulted in unusual large gifts being given to Jesus. This gold was likely held in trust for him until he was older. Of course, it was kept in trust by Joseph. And when he reached legal adulthood, Jesus controlled it. Also, since Jesus' mentor, Joseph of Arimathea, was also wealthy, one can be sure Jesus shared in that wealth. In all cultures and times, wealth can open a lot of doors. So Jesus, financially, was wealthy due to the gifts, due to Joseph of Arimathea, and that's the reason why he and his disciples could give to the poor. It was also why Judas stole from the treasury, because there was probably a lot of money in that treasury that they had. So Jesus was a wealthy man. He wasn't some poor wretch dwelling in the dust of Palestine, all dirty and grimy. He was a wealthy man. Why do you think the Romans wanted his clothing when he was on the cross? They were gambling for his clothes. Well, because he was a wealthy man, had nice clothes. So Jesus was a wealthy man. Now, what about the star in the east? It's interesting about this star in the east. Many people believe, and many people are trying to have these scenarios where they're trying to look in the ancient records about certain comets and stars that aligned during that time to try to pinpoint when Jesus was actually born. But that's not what the Bible says. It says that when the star, let me read in verse 9, it says, when they heard the king that they departed, lo, the star which they saw in the east went before them till it came and, quote, stood over where the young child was. Comets don't do that. Now, a star is a symbol of an angel. And if you notice, only the Magi saw the star, and that the star appeared and then reappeared before the Magi. So this wasn't some comet in the sky or some alignment of planets or whatever. It was an angel. It came and stood over where the young child was. They were being guided by an angel. But why does the Bible use the language of a star? Well, because during the time of the Feast of Tabernacles, stargazing was the habit during the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. People looked at the star because of that old prophecy of a star that shall come out of Jacob that you read of in Numbers, the 24th chapter, verse 17. So it was a tradition of looking at the stars during the time of the Feast of Tabernacles. I want to read you this from Samuele Bacciocchi's book, God's Festivals in Scripture and History. Excellent book. If you go to a Seventh-day Adventist bookstore, you could probably pick up this book. And he says on page 244, we are told that the wise men made their journey from the east to Bethlehem because they have seen the star in the east. Watching the stars was associated especially with the Feast of Tabernacles. In fact, the Ruth of the Booth, as noted in chapter 6, was built with leafy branches carefully spaced so that they would screen out the sunlight without blocking the visibility of the stars. The people watch for the stars at night during the feast because of the prophecy, a star shall come out of Jacob. It is possible that it was during the Feast of Tabernacles, that the special season of star watching, that the wise men saw the messianic star and rejoiced exceedingly with great joy, because many of the Parthians that you read in Acts, the 2nd chapter, verse 9, many of the Parthians believed and worshiped God, and no doubt had the law of God and knew some of these prophecies. And of course, this was done during the Feast of Tabernacles, and we show you another broadcast that Jesus was born on the Feast of Tabernacles, and that Christmas is a pagan holiday. I mean, even Hollywood, for pity's sake, knows that Christmas is a pagan holiday. I remember I was watching television one time with my son. He was watching a show called The Big Bang Theory, and I saw this clip, and I couldn't believe it when I saw it and on television about Christmas and the origins of Christmas. Take a look at this clip.
Hey, Sheldon, are you and Leonard putting up a Christmas tree?
No, because we don't celebrate the ancient pagan festival of Saturnalia.
Saturnalia?
Gather round, kids. It's time for Sheldon's beloved Christmas special.
In the pre-Christian era, as the winter solstice approached and the plants died, pagans brought evergreen boughs into their homes as an act of sympathetic magic intended to guard the life essences of the plants until spring. This custom was later appropriated by Northern Europeans, and eventually it becomes the so-called Christmas tree.
Isn't that amazing? Sheldon Cooper there, who's played by Jim Parsons, says that Christmas is a pagan festival, the pagan Saturnalia, and that the Christians took up this pagan festival of December 25th and renamed it and called it Christian. Hollywood knows. Why is it that Christians, the majority of Christians, don't know? Well, you can know. Get this free booklet. Is Christmas Christian, free of charge, off our website, britishisrael.ca. This is Peter Salemi saying goodbye, friends, and I'll see you here next time on the Watchman program.